Hi everyone, welcome to this afternoon's event. I'm Jonathan Heawood, Director of the Public Interest News Foundation in the UK, and I'm really pleased to be here with Silvia Rivera, Director of Local News at the MacArthur Foundation in the US. And we're going to talk about how do we use philanthropy to try to rebuild local news in the US. Before we get on, we haven't got long today. There's a group of us here. It's great that we've all come for this event on the last day of an incredible festival. I'm sure we're all like fully information overloaded, but we're going to try and finish with a bang. But just so we know who we're talking to and who's in this conversation today, can you put up your hand, any of you who actually work in local news or have worked in local news, okay? And anyone else who also hasn't worked in local news but kind of cares about local news and thinks it's a good thing. And put up your hand if you kind of have a basic sense that there's a bit of a problem at the moment with local news, like it's really hard to make it pay, to make it sustainable, to engage audiences, to protect yourself against all the threats. Okay, so I won't do an introduction then. We know why we're here. The particular topic of discussion in a moment Silvia and I will get into before we open up for wider discussion is the Press Forward initiative. So last year, the MacArthur Foundation, where Silvia works, and a bunch of other big US foundations got together and said, look, we think local news is really important. We think it's facing an existential crisis in the US. So these big foundations came together and pledged initially up to $500 million to try to save local news in the US. Now, to most of us who aren't in the US, $500 million sounds like a lot of money. There are some who say it's not enough. So we're going to talk about this and how do you use those amazing number of dollars wisely to try to create something really viable and sustainable. But before we get into that, I wanted just to give you, Silvia, a chance to kind of introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your background. I know you've worked in local news yourself in Chicago and around the US.
Sure.
And what first attracted you to this job where you get to sit on top of huge amounts of money?
No pressure.
Yeah.
Well, I am pretty new to this role. I've been in my position as Director of Local News now for 3 months. And really, my entire career has been in this community media space. I started working at a community radio station in Chicago that really focused on serving a very small Mexican-American community on the southwest side of Chicago, serving them with not just news and information, but using music as a gateway to engage the community and develop news and public affairs programming related to issues that were important to this community. After that, I moved on to a bigger newsroom in Chicago, Chicago Public Media, which owns the NPR affiliate in town. And there, I managed their second service focused on reaching younger and more diverse audiences in Chicago, again with a similar format of using music and culture as a gateway, but leveraging WBEZ reporters and the local news ecosystem to engage the community around issues that were important to them. In my most recent role, I was more looking at things from a national perspective. I was working with an organization called the Listening Post Collective, which is a project of Internews. Internews works globally, but the Listening Post Collective is the US portfolio of this work, and really focusing on how do you build local news and information outlets in the most vulnerable communities across the country. And that work was really rooted in this idea that in order to do this type of work, you needed to first start with an information ecosystem assessment to truly understand the community's information needs, to really find out how people were consuming news and information, and then to develop ideas and solutions that were custom made for that community. Right. And so having done that for 3 years and seeing, taking my personal experiences and understanding the challenges of running a small newsroom, but then also looking at it from a national perspective, it just really was serendipitous that this opportunity opened up and that I'm able to bring this experience and this point of view to this new role, which is a complex set of issues, but then also one where I think is primed for some really innovative approaches and solutions to trying to mend the local news crisis, because I don't know that we can entirely solve it, but
Right.
we can take steps to seed some solutions.
So tell us a bit about Press Forward. So there's this big headline figure that made the news, and lots of us took a keen interest, $500 million to rebuild local news. What is Press Forward? Is Press Forward an entity? Is it a thing? Does all the MacArthur money now go through Press Forward? Who decides?
Yeah.
Just explain a bit about the architecture.
Lots of really good questions.
Yeah.
So Press Forward, really, it's a national movement with the goal in mind to strengthen local communities and democracy by revitalizing local news. And that's really led by a coalition of funders across the US who decided local news was a real issue and said, we're going to collectively invest $500 million in trying to find solutions for this. And that's really across 4 different pillars. One is really strengthening local newsrooms. Second is to address some of the longstanding issues with coverage, journalism coverage in communities, some of those coverage gaps. 3, really looking at supporting groups that could address some of the public policy issues needed to make the local news ecosystem stronger. And then 4, addressing some of the infrastructure challenges and scaling some solutions nationally. And so in building a movement, as anybody might imagine, it's very challenging. It's, how do you bring donors together that have different interests, that may have not thought about local news and information being an issue in their community? Well, Press Forward created different pathways for funders to participate. And the way to participate is you can either participate as a pooled funder, so contributing to a pooled fund that will then be distributed according to guidelines and criteria that are created by Press Forward. They could either participate as an aligned funder. So as an aligned funder, you make a commitment that you're either going to go above and beyond your current commitments to local news or journalism, or you're going to invest in local news and journalism for the first time, but perhaps in a subject area that you're interested in. So that might be climate, that might be rural communities, that might be historically Black colleges and universities. So whatever your sort of thematic approach is in your portfolio, you're now finding a way to think about how to align yourself in this movement. And then the third is through Press Forward local chapters. So in addition to the $500 million commitment that we're collectively setting the floor for, we're also trying to incentivize local Press Forward chapters to emerge in different communities. And so the idea there is that Press Forward local chapters will address community issues informed by information ecosystem assessments and do placemaking, grant-making in their own communities. And Press Forward National will support some of those efforts and catalyze some of those efforts.
And is there a time period? Is this like a 10-year moonshot? We're going to solve the local news crisis in a fixed period? Or is it the beginning of something which could go on forever?
I mean, I think as with any movement, it's going to, I don't think that there's a fixed time date to the movement. I think that it's going to evolve, it's going to iterate, based on what we've learned. At MacArthur, we have created a portfolio for local news as an aligned funder of Press Forward. And we've said, this is something that wasn't a part of our grant-making strategy. We're going to create a local news portfolio. We're in it for at minimum 5 years, and we're going to invest $150 million into this initiative. And so, again, in alignment with Press Forward National, the MacArthur Foundation is developing a strategy looking at these different pillars and seeing where we might have the most impact in solving for the local news.
So for you personally then, with your background working in community radio, working at the Listening Post, if we came back in 5 years' time and you at MacArthur or also working with Press Forward, if things have changed in local news and you've been successful, what does that difference look like?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that part of my onboarding now is that clearly I bring a point of view about where there are the most challenges, but I'm also trying to do as much listening and understand the market as best as I can so that when we present a formal strategy, which we will at the end of this year, and align our grant making to support that strategy, that we have a set of metrics and ways that we want to evaluate our impact. Currently, and I can sort of, guess and think about, what type of world would I like to see. I would really like to see communities that suddenly had an influx of capital that they would have never received. And because of that, we catalyzed, the ecosystem for them, and that their communities are healthier because of it. Because suddenly they have the tools and the foundation to do their work and to really impact their communities. And so I think that, how we define success, that's always sort of a murky sort of response. But, really I think the impact has to go beyond numbers and really looking at it as, what are sort of the civic impact metrics that we're looking at, especially with smaller newsrooms.
And in terms of who you're supporting to achieve that happy vision, is that, it seems to me there's three broad categories of local news providers. There's the legacy providers, the old print, but also radio, TV, who've been around for a long time. There's the more recent, mainly online providers who came up in the last 5, 10, 15 years, trying to do something new, sometimes speaking for communities who lacked a voice in the past. And then there's the providers that don't even exist yet, where you have real gaps and real deserts. Where do you think you're going to be prioritizing?
Well, I think, again, I'm making an assumption here, again, based on my own experience and my intuition on where there needs to be more support. And when I'm looking at vulnerable communities across the country that perhaps are not only in news deserts, but they're also in transit deserts and food deserts, they're in, poverty, deserts. And so when I look at those communities and I think about, the surrounding environment that they're in and the fact that there probably isn't any philanthropic support or even your typical infrastructure that would make a business plan viable for these communities, that's really where I'm thinking we could have the most impact. If we could not only inject an initial sort of round of funding to these trusted messengers that may already exist or that may emerge from this type of call to action, that there just is an opportunity, right, to cultivate what I've shared with you, that it's not just, it's news deserts, but it's information gardens, right?
Yeah.
That we can really focus on that.
Yeah. I want to open up in a moment to start to think about your questions and comments, but I guess my final question is, one of the critiques of journalism philanthropy is from those who say journalism should be somehow magically, totally independent. It shouldn't depend on any single major donor. It should survive through some kind of earned revenue. What do you say to that critique?
I think that that's fair in certain environments. I think that that's fair in an environment where there, is a healthy, socio-economic environment where there are opportunities for folks to build revenue streams through corporate sponsors, through events, through merchandise, through all of these sort of, revenue streams that, some are more traditional and some are more innovative. And so I think it's fair to challenge organizations to think creatively and look at the environment that they're in and really tap into all of the different, pull all the different levers to maximize their sustainability. But again, I think that not all communities are the beneficiaries of that.
Yeah.
And so we have to look at this from a civic infrastructure point of view. There are going to be some communities that are going to need enduring philanthropic investments, or, if not from philanthropy, from donors or from, government as well.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, can I have some hands up, questions and comments? There's a lady in the yellow jacket. I'll start there, then I'll come to the gentleman in the blue coat. Thank you.
Hi there. My name's Liz Misen. I'm from the Bristol Cable in the UK, and I'm interested to know about sort of impact and what you might be measuring when local news organisations come to Press Forward and ask them for specific amounts of money. Is there specific impact that you want to see from locals? I think that's something that I've experienced. It's very difficult to show impact on the scale that funders would like to see sometimes. So obviously because your fund is set up specifically for locals, I'm interested to know how you might be requesting that kind of evidence from them and what it might look like.
Thanks, Liz. I'll take two or three, and then we'll group them. So the gentleman here in the middle with the blue coat. Thank you. Oh, they're here, I think. Thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to get your sense of how much you think small for-profit models should be a part of the discussion. I'm extremely biased because I co-founded a worker-owned publication in New York. So we're able to take some philanthropy money, but also we're subscription-based, we're supported by our readers, we want that mix. So curious to hear your thoughts on small for-profit entities being part of the program.
Great question, thank you. I think there was another one over here. Thank you.
Hi, just to follow up on Ili's question, I've been working with the Dutch Journalism Fund for a while, and we've been investing government money in local news, which is in a way problematic, but it worked. And one of the things actually to follow up on what Ilis asked, like, what do you want on impact? I was wondering as well, when people, local organizations apply for funding, you have to have like certain questions that you ask, or like certain goals or targets that you set. And then there's always that, metrics. That's the first thing that comes to mind. But then you can also ask different questions, and then also maybe offer ways or like certain standards that you want them to comply with that are not necessarily metrics. But I was wondering what's your strategy on this?
Great, thank you. Okay, 3 really easy questions.
Of course. Well, let me just be, transparent on the impact piece. I mean, I think that with this impact and evaluation question, I mean, I think that that's still, TBD. And part of that is because you need to develop, have an understanding of what you want to prioritize and invest in, what the strategy is going to be to evaluate, to create the evaluation framework. And I think that that's true for, MacArthur is going to be undergoing a series of conversations and strategy sessions this year that will lead to leading into conversations about impact and evaluation. And I know that that's also true for Press Forward. But relatedly, and just, Press Forward is releasing an RFP later this month, and that RFP is going to be focused on supporting smaller local newsrooms, and I anticipate that in most cases, these newsrooms, this will be the first significant amount of revenue and investment in their organizations. And so part of what, sort of the top line assessment that we're looking at in terms of the type of impact and also how we're looking at selecting the folks who will eventually receive the funding is, will this create the foundational opportunity for for a sustainability plan to evolve? Again, recognizing the challenges of that, but will this, give you the capacity to perhaps hire a grant writer? And if you hired a grant writer, what was the outcome of that? If you finally paid yourself, because you've been doing this as a volunteer, founder, what impact will that have? So I think there will be some variations of what impact looks like, and we have to be comfortable as foundations in taking risks and in learning from the process.
The for-profit model, are you open to for-profits?
I mean, I actually, with some of the smaller newsrooms that I've worked in that have put themselves on the pathway to becoming nonprofits because they think that's going to unlock a whole host of funding streams, I actually advise against that, at least initially, because becoming a nonprofit comes with a whole host of governance issues that these smaller newsrooms just don't have the capacity and oftentimes the understanding on what that means. That's a whole other job. Managing a board is a whole other job. And so when I look at, especially in vulnerable communities and communities of color across the US, that oftentimes these small hyper-local newsrooms that are starting, they are, LLCs or unincorporated or on that pathway of sort of a more commercial model. And so I'm a proponent of all sorts of models, and I don't have a bias towards for-profit or profit, but I think that we need to take an expansive view on how we catalyze these newsrooms.
Great, thank you very much. Let's get some more questions. There's one right at the front. Thank you, and then I'm going to go to the back. So I'm just going to keep you exercising.
Hi, I'm curious about your frameworks or plans to distribute the money in a way that's equitable to publications that are, that don't publish in English, community ethnic media, by publications founded by people of color that cover marginalized communities, et cetera, et cetera. Like, we know that philanthropy historically has not, it's been much harder for people of marginalized identities and communities to get that sort of funding. So what is the framework you have in place so that doesn't get replicated?
Yeah.
Fantastic question,
Yeah,
thank
it's
you.
a
And
great
again,
question.
I'll go, there was, who have we got? There's a gentleman over on the side, near the door.
Hi, Dan from Internews, and thanks for the shout out for the Listening Post Collective. We're very proud of that work. As I understand it, you're focused primarily, at least initially, on US-based media, is that correct?
Yes.
And do you have any plans at some point to potentially expand internationally? And either way, whether you do or not, will you sort of be gathering lessons along the way that could inform other foundations that do work and plan to work internationally to replicate this very important work?
Great question. One close to my heart in the UK. And I think there was a gentleman right in the back far corner. Yeah, thank you.
Trevor Snap from GISA Group. We're a media development organization in Sudan. We actually partner with Internews. And just to carry on that question, I think what we're looking at is really low quality money in Africa. So we get paid to do workshops, we get paid to do content production. But the moment you put something for a fundraiser, it's not going to be pushed through. And so I think we're all kind of trapped. And this kind of money you're talking about, this is high quality money. This is money that actually builds your organization. And Sudan, in the context, you have 10, 20 newsrooms that are now in exile trying to set up and figure out their model for moving forward. I'm just building off of that. Are you seeing any of these models and these lessons being moved and taken into the international community, where I think a lot of this is very interesting, but you're not seeing really movement at all? It's just kind of stuck.
Okay, so actually a range of kind of related equity questions, really. Equity within the US and then equity outside the US. Any thoughts on these?
Yeah, so I'll start with the equity in the US, and I think I can speak for Press Forward, the Press Forward team, and also for MacArthur. We're lucky in that there is a lot of research out there about where there is the most need in terms of where there are philanthropy deserts as well, what areas, there's the news desert research. Press Forward is currently commissioning a research study, which is actually being led by the Listening Post Collective, where they are identifying areas that are primed for civic media opportunities. And a lot of the factors that are being used to assess that is, again, geographically, from a regional perspective, trying to map out, again, the communities that have traditionally been left out of philanthropic conversations. So there's that research underway. The Borealis Foundation is also another leader in thinking about investments in the space. They're soon going to present a huge research study that talks about the investments that need to be made in especially newsrooms that are led by and for people of color, and they're calling for billion-dollar investments, which is the financial modeling that they're doing is also going to be influential in all of our thinking, and then MacArthur Foundation as well is doing we're doing our own market research, keeping in mind all of the research that's in the pipeline, with an idea of, again, this is like I wouldn't call it a moonshot, but it is an opportunity to make equitable distribution in areas like the South, for example, of the US, where there just have not been investments to catalyze local newsrooms, in rural areas across the country, in immigrant communities, Spanish language, speaking outlets. I mean, this is why it's so important that this is a movement and this is a coalition, because there might be some investments that I might not be able to make, but the Knight Foundation can,
Right.
Democracy Fund can, Borealis, and so having a collective understanding of what this landscape looks like and then being able to mobilize around those decisions is going to be really, really powerful. And then, on the question of the international approach, and please show me some grace, as again, I'm 3 months into this role, but right now we are focused on the US, recognizing that this is a global issue, and just being in conversations with Jonathan and others here in Europe as well, just thinking about what some of the modeling that Press Forward can provide for others as well, recognizing that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, that everybody's going to take sort of like the practices that are relevant to them. And we certainly want to be open about our, I'm not counting on the failures yet, but our learnings, and being sure that we're being an open book about our process and our sharing our learnings as well. So there aren't any immediate plans to solve on an international level, but we're in partnership and friendship as we're trying to build this movement.
Great, thank you, Silvia. And I can say, we are at Public Interest News Foundation in the UK. We're working with MacArthur to think about how we can take lessons about how they built that movement, how they got non-journalism funders to start thinking about local news. Very quickly, we're out of time. I just want to finish by asking Silvia, it's your first time at Perugia, at the festival. How have you found it? What are you going to take back to Chicago with you?
I mean, it's been so inspiring, obviously, being in this having this beautiful background behind us, but then also just, being able to feel like we're not alone in this struggle, that there are parallels to, what's happening across, all parts of the world, that there are creative solutions out there, and that sometimes being in a room with folks can spark magical conversations and ideas and collaborations. So I'm leaving very, very inspired and very validated, also with some of the conversations that I've eavesdropped on as well, of just just sitting there sort of yesing some of the conversations and feeling affirmed and inspired when I get back home.
Great, fantastic. I think that's why we're all here, isn't it? Yeah, and I think we all get that. It's a wonderful festival. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to Silvia. Thank you.
Experience Umbria through the European Union's cohesion policy.